Good afternoon, my lord.
Good afternoon, Mr. Stephen. Now, what do you have for us this afternoon, please?
My lord, the next witness giving evidence this afternoon is Karen Hedge of Scottish Care.
Good afternoon, Miss Hedge.
Good afternoon.
Right, Mr. Stephen will have some questions for you.
Thank you, my lord. Good afternoon. Could I ask by just getting you to confirm your full name to begin with, please?
It's Karen Louise Hedge.
Thank you. Now, you provided a written response to this inquiry already in respect of this business and welfare support phase of the inquiry. For the record, that reference number is SCI-WT 0159 5 zeros and a 2. And for completeness, you previously also gave oral evidence to this inquiry, I think on the 22nd of March 2024 during the Health and Social Care impact hearings. And just for completeness, the reference for that written statement is SCI-WT 0159 5 zeros and a 1. Just to reiterate that everything that you said in those statements will be taken into account by the inquiry, even if we don't touch on all of that in your evidence today. And just a gentle reminder, the hearing is being transcribed and we have stenographers, so please do try and speak slowly and clearly, as I'm sure you will. Thank you.
Thank you.
So you're here today to give evidence on behalf of Scottish Care, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. And your current role there is as Deputy Chief Executive Officer, is that right?
That's correct.
And how long have you held that role for?
Oh, a year and a half? I'm not sure.
Yeah. And what was your role during the pandemic with Scottish Care?
National Director.
Thank you. Now, Scottish Care is a registered charity and membership organisation representing independent social care services in Scotland. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
Thank you. What is the size of the membership in Scotland of Scottish Care, both now and during the pandemic?
So you'll note that in our written statement we speak about our members covering over 900 services. Actually, I've just had a check today, and that number has reduced to 874. And looking at the reasons for that, that's because of closures of care services across Scotland, which will be relevant to today because this is about financial sustainability.
Thank you. And we'll come back to that point, I think, in your evidence later on. Thank you. You mentioned, I think, 900 services there. Could I ask you just to expand on the size and range of those membership organisations that are part of Scottish Care, please, and the services that they deliver?
Of course. So our membership ranges from care homes, care at home, to daycare services as well, and some housing support organisations too. They range in size from single owner operators. The majority of our members are family run organisations, about 2 to 3 services, all the way through to sort of large organisations, of which there are about 4 or 5 in Scotland at the moment.
Thank you. And are all of those membership organisations profit making?
The care providers, no, they're not. Some are charities and some are employee owned as well, though it's our charities that have particularly taken a financial hit since the pandemic.
Thank you. So I think you say at paragraph 3 of your written response to the inquiry that there's often a presumption that significant profits will be made, I think, by care homes, but I think the point made there is that that's not always the case.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you'll see in the IBIS World report that 1.8% profit margin for care homes with nursing, and for dom care, the average profit margin being 3.4%. Maybe if I put that into context, a hairdresser profit margin is sitting around about 11%. And that profit margin is necessary for organisations to reinvest, for instance, into capital, so into the buildings, into the structure, also for training and development for staff, things like that as well. So what people think of when they think of profit in social care is not always the reality.
Thank you. In paragraph 4 of that written response, you state that most care homes in Scotland are funded through the National Care Home Contract. Now, for those who are perhaps unfamiliar with what that is, could you please outline what that cost model is, please?
Yes. So several years ago now, about 10 years ago, Scottish Care and COSLA developed something called a cost model to basically have a transparent record of how much it costs for someone to live in a care home per week. Now, that model hasn't really been updated in that period of time. So you can imagine, the type of care and support that's delivered now is quite different. People come into care homes now at quite a different stage of life, often have multiple comorbidities, things like advanced dementia, which require much greater staffing, much different skill set. Obviously, our care expectations are different now as well, and what we would anticipate and what we would require is very, very different too. That cost model hasn't kept up with that at all. So just one example, for instance, we're in 2024, nowhere in that cost model is there a line for anything digital or any technology. So you can see that if that cost model hasn't updated, then the amount that the council would be paying the care home wouldn't be there. So that cost model is what's used to determine how much would be paid to care homes through the National Care Home Contract.
Thank you. And therefore it's implicit in what you're saying that that cost model was in place during the pandemic also?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Now, paragraph 6 of the written response, I think you say it was a difficult time for care providers during the pandemic, and we'll come on to talk about the financial sustainability arrangements that were in place that you mentioned in that response. But for now, could I ask you just to give an overview, I suppose, in headline terms of how significant the impact of the pandemic was on the operating costs of social care providers and in particular care homes?
Absolutely. So I guess the two biggest issues in terms of costs were the PPE costs, which we saw increasing by 100%, and insurance costs, because we saw all but one insurance broker exiting the market, which of course then meant that the one left standing obviously increased their rates substantially. And actually I've just said two things, but I'd probably add workforce costs into that as well, because obviously more people were having to take time off because they were catching COVID or being ill or having to self-isolate too, so that put additional financial requirements upon care organisations.
And at paragraph 7 of the written response, I think you mentioned staff and staffing costs. I think agency staff in particular. Was that an increase in costs for homes having to rely on agency staff if other staff were unwell or unavailable due to the pandemic?
Yes. So there was increased agency staff use, as you say, because we were requiring to backfill those shifts when people were having to take time off.
Thank you. And you mentioned earlier about the cost model, the National Care Home Contract. Did that cater for these increased operating costs that social care providers were seeing during the pandemic?
No, it didn't. It doesn't have any mechanism to, chop or change or inflate or deflate depending on what market conditions are.
Thank you. I want to turn then to the financial support that was available from the Scottish Government during the pandemic, and the written response that Scottish Care has provided highlights, I think, two funds in particular. Firstly, the Sustainability Fund, and then secondly, the Social Care Staff Support Fund. And I propose just to take each of those in turn, if I may, and starting with the Sustainability Fund. At paragraph 9 of the written response provided, I think it states that the Scottish Government established the National Contingency Planning Group at the outset of the pandemic, and then at paragraph 10, I think there's also mention of a subgroup of which I think you personally and others were members of. Could I ask you just to explain, if you can, the role of those groupings in the creation of the Sustainability Fund, please?
Yes, so the NCPG was where people came together across health and social care, really to troubleshoot on all matters relating to the pandemic. Obviously things were moving very quickly at that point in time, so we would come together twice a week at times, to make sure that we could be as far ahead as possible in terms of responding to the pandemic. The subgroup that was set up to manage the Sustainability Fund sort of reported into that group. So at the National contingency planning group, we reported that there were issues of sustainability, and so it was recommended this subgroup be set up.
Thank you. And without necessarily naming the individuals themselves, how were those groups comprised? From where were they drawn?
Yep. So from Scottish Care, from a sort of a sister organisation, CCPS, from government, and from COSLA.
Thank you. Moving on then to the operation of that fund itself, when did that fund actually come into being, come into operation, do you recall?
No, I'd need to check my notes. It was a wee while ago now.
Thank you. Can I ask then by whom that fund was administered? Who was responsible for administering the funds?
Yes, so access was via local authorities, or in the instances of NHS, in the instance of the Highland, it would be NHS Highland, because they were the authority in charge there. And that was one of the challenges, because it meant that we had a different experience of accessing that fund in each of the different regions of Scotland.
Thank you. And we'll come on to that in a moment. Were those local authorities, were they provided with any guidance or criteria on which to assess funding applications?
So one of the tasks of that subgroup was exploring, what sort of challenges might arise as a result of the Sustainability Fund. And I should point out that actually, this was a good piece of work. This was people coming together, to try and support the social care sector at a time. People come together across the system to do that. So we always came together with that intention to be able to troubleshoot effectively where problems arose. But certainly we saw that there were challenges in the implementation of that. Sorry, could you ask your question again, please?
Yeah, no problem at all. I was really just to ask whether local authorities were given any, I suppose, central or otherwise guidance as to how they would go about assessing applications for funding.
Yep. So one of the conversations that we had at that subgroup was, how do we support local authorities and NHS Highland, how to deliver that effectively, because we started to see the different implementation routes. There was a reluctance initially to, write things down in black and white, because the way that the pandemic was moving quickly, we didn't want to be too prescriptive and stop investment in areas that were required by not having listed that in a piece of guidance. But it became evident that how it was being implemented was so wide that some guidance was necessary. So two things happened. One was that group did come together and produce a piece of guidance, which was issued to local authorities, but also we had a session with finance officers from across Scotland coming together with providers to sort of do a bit of debunking of myths around about it as well, and have a good, honest, open conversation about how the Sustainability Fund could be used.
Thank you. Now, you touched on it a second ago in your evidence. I think you say it, and it's also in the written response at paragraph 21, talking about the significant variances, I think, in the way in which funding was being distributed at that local level. So I'd like to explore that with you. Can I start with the application process itself then, please, and then we can move on to talk about what could be claimed, etc. But staying with just the application itself, how straightforward or onerous was that application process for social care providers?
So for some, it was not onerous at all. It would be a case of explaining to the local authority what sort of things you needed to purchase. Some local authorities gave funding in advance because care providers couldn't necessarily afford to purchase the things in advance. And in those areas, things functioned well. In other areas, it's much more complicated. So access was open book, which meant that providers had to provide copies of their accounts to local authorities. People had to apply for the funding in arrears, so after they had already purchased the items, But because they didn't know explicitly what they could or could not purchase, often they would purchase things and then were told, oh, you weren't allowed to buy that. But as I say, it was really varied across the country. You know, some areas were extremely supportive, and in other areas it was a very, very lengthy process, sometimes taking months and months and months to see the funding coming back through to care providers at the end of it all.
Thank you. You mentioned that mixture in practice. Paragraph 23 of the written response, I think you say, was that the majority of local authorities or health and social care providers were adopting that system that required sort of retrospective application. So that was the case for most people who were applying, and then I think you also said there was instances where people could apply in advance, but the majority were having to do so retrospectively. Could you elaborate on the administrative burden of having to make those applications? Presumably care home providers were, and just care providers generally, were having to deal with a number of different things at that time. Could you elaborate on the administrative burden in making these applications?
Yes, I mean, obviously pandemic response was an incredibly difficult time for care providers as it is. Admin staff and care homes in particular were spending a lot more time having to rearrange staffing rotas, make sure there was enough PPE. So they already had an additional workload based upon them. To have to go through to pull out all of the accounts, to make those visible, to make an educated guess about what would be acceptable in terms of funding and spend was always a wee bit risky for them. And to then, for many of them, have to almost argue with local authorities about whether or not that was a satisfactory spend actually meant that many of them stopped chasing down the funds that they were entitled to receive as well, because they were much more focused on making sure that people were getting the right care at that point in time.
And I think you speak again at that paragraph 23 about having to be heavily evidenced. And I think later on in the written response it talks about a line-by-line process being taken by some local authorities. So how much time were social care providers having to take away from their other caring duties to fulfil this?
I mean, significant amounts. They were genuinely looking for, it was an open book account, so access to their complete accounts at that point in time. So that was a lot of time spent having to do that, and also questionable in terms of sharing business information over email addresses into local authority emails as well. So there's the amount of time that was spent on admin just seemed completely disproportionate to the spend that was being made. And there was also, when this was raised at that point in time, we were told that it would be acceptable to claim further funds to pay for additional admin. Now, we know there was a huge workforce shortage at that point in time, so it was actually really difficult to get more staff to be able to administrate that, but it just seemed incredibly bizarre to spend money to do a process of evidencing why you should be spending that money to such a finite detail on that line-by-line basis.
Presumably you would suggest that a lighter touch approach might be something that could be adopted in the event of a future event like the pandemic.
Yeah, so things like clearer guidance or tolerances around about how much spend could be made, maybe as a percentage or a banding within, which people could then work within. Because it might be actually what one care provider needed to spend to make their service work effectively might not be what another care provider. So, for one example, one care home actually funded for a porta cabin in their car park so that staff could undertake testing before they went into the care home, which made a lot of sense because it meant that if they were to test positive, that wasn't then they weren't taking that into the care home with them. They were able to seal that down. Whereas in other organisations for care at home, for instance, that wouldn't be acceptable. They would need to come up with another resolution for that. So it's about being much more flexible, and there are better ways of doing that.
Thank you. You talked earlier on about the increased operating costs, and then also about how there was retrospective applications having to be made. What kind of financial pressures was that therefore placing on social care providers?
So we still have social care providers who haven't received some of their funding through this route. And of course, local authorities had to return their funds to Scottish Government when they were unspent at the end of this process. So that money is now no longer available to them. We're also in a period of time where, as a country, we've had significant increase in, inflation, additional business costs, workforce shortages in the sector. So it's sort of been a perfect storm, really, for social care. And we've seen more closures in the sector than ever before, particularly in rural and remote areas. I spoke earlier about the National Care Home contract, and that's based around about a 50-bedded home. Now, particularly in our rural and remote areas, many of those care homes are smaller than that. Of course, for our care at home organisations, it's just as challenging for them too. What we saw for them in the pandemic as well was actually fewer people were getting access to a social care service. So effectively that meant they had less business coming into them as well, and that affected them sustainably as well.
Thank you. You touched on this already, I think, with the example you gave of the porta cabins, in terms of consistency of what could be claimed for. Are there any other examples that you would bring to the attention of the inquiry where perhaps in one local authority something could be claimed and in another that wasn't the case?
Yes, laptops would be one. So as you can imagine, for care homes, actually, home working had never been a thing before. But actually, if an admin function could be undertaken at home, it would make sense for that individual to do that, because that reduces footfall into the home. And from 1 month to the next, laptops were available as part of the Sustainability Fund, and then suddenly they weren't because we were told that they should have been claimed for already. So it's those idiosyncrasies that just made it really difficult to stay sort of ahead of the game. And it's almost as though providers had to come together and have a conversation and say, oh, what did you get this month? Am I able to claim for this? I'm thinking of getting a heater for the garden. Is that okay? Is that something, it's sort of just added that additional level of burden into this process, which ultimately then affected what the people living in the care homes or accessing care and support in their own home could get.
And in paragraph 37 of the written response, I think you talk about that. I think particular confusion, I think, is the way that it's put when providers were operating services in more than one area. How did the providers that were operating across local authorities cope with that inconsistency?
Well, of course, if you operate in more than one area, then that means you're having to submit your claim in each area in which you operate. So that made it very difficult, because you might find something that you had paid for and these are not real examples, but since we're in Edinburgh, I'll say, imagine you bought something in Edinburgh, imagine you bought something in Ayrshire. It might be acceptable in Edinburgh, but wouldn't be acceptable in Ayrshire. So it really, they couldn't then make sort of central decisions about what they were able to purchase and what they weren't.
Thank you. And at paragraph 41 of the written response, I think it's mentioned that there was never a definitive list of what could be claimed. Is that something that Scottish Care would suggest should be put in place again next time, or another approach?
And this is the difficult one, because once you make a list, what happens if you need something that's not on the list? Particularly in a pandemic, when you're dealing with the unknown. But really there needs to be continuity, and that's what we didn't have. So as I'm saying, from one iteration of the fund, laptops were acceptable to claim. To the next iteration, suddenly they weren't. So there needs to be consistency throughout. Certainly some guidance which has some suggestions of things that would be eligible, or some parameters about what they would be used for. So is it to support the welfare and the care and support that an individual can access at that point in time? And then there needs to be a sort of a get-out clause. What happens if there's something that's not on the list? Where do we go? And actually, the troubleshooting group would be a good place for that, except the troubleshooting group had no authority over the local authorities to deliver.
The troubleshooting group that you mentioned,
The subgroup of the NCPG. Sorry, we called it the troubleshooting group in our chat. So that's
Just,
it.
just wanted to be clear, yeah. No.
Colloquial wording. Sorry.
No, thank you. Now, you've talked there, I think, about the uncertainty of what could be claimed. You also talk in the written response about excluded costs, and you mentioned in passing earlier, I think, insurance. Was that something that Scottish Care felt should have been covered by this particular fund?
So at that point in time, we asked Scottish Government to underwrite the impact for social care on the basis that it was doing that for other health and social care in-house provision, and that because there was nothing available to the sector, should anything happen, then as the commissioning body for that, we saw the risk lay there in the event of there being no insurance available. So even if it's not them and that's not the solution, we need to consider what would happen in future should there be a further pandemic and then there's no insurance available.
Because I think you make the point, don't you, that without that insurance cover you wouldn't be able to register, as is a requirement by the Care Inspectorate.
That's correct, yes. You're not a fully fledged organisation without your registration. If you aren't registered, then you have to close down, and you need to have insurance to be registered.
Thank you. I want to ask about the speed at which those who could access that fund were able to do so. Were those funds made readily available? How long did it take from application being made to those funds being distributed?
Yet again, it was one of those postcode lottery situations. So, as I say, some areas paid in advance and then sort of settled up afterwards because they recognised in the pandemic everything was going quickly and they just needed to get things off the ground to sort of stabilise what was happening. But as I say, I still have providers who haven't had funding. Many providers are waiting 6 months. That was not unusual.
And what was the reason or reasons for the delays that you mentioned?
Well, of course, everyone was having workforce shortages at that point in time. So for local authorities, they were also experiencing workforce shortages in their admin and finance teams, which was causing the issue. Hence the issue with the thoroughness of that line-by-line open book submission, because it put more burden on them to deliver as well. If you think of the time taken and the burden of that and the cost that eventually led to in the system, actually, if you lost a bit of money there, or you saved a bit of money there in the administrative part, and it was potentially lost in the delivery part, actually it's neither here nor there.
So local authorities were obviously responsible for the processing of these applications, but I take it as what you're saying is they didn't necessarily have the level of administrative support that they would need in order to undertake that line-by-line
That's correct,
process.
Yeah.
Okay. Given what you said, then, could social care providers plan ahead financially or not?
No, they couldn't, and that was the biggest problem with the fund. I mean, the fund was a good thing. I really have to make the point where the fund was put in place. It was put in place, arrangements were made quickly by government to put that in place once we raised it. Where funds were passed on, it worked incredibly well, and having spoken to banks, they have told us that it did keep the sector sustainable during the pandemic, and that's what it was meant to do. So that is ultimately a good thing. But no, there were definitely challenges, again, depending on where you were. Sometimes yes, sometimes no.
And earlier in your evidence, I think you talked about the reinvestment of profits when those were made. Again, was that something that was able to be done during this period?
So sorry, back to the earlier point that you just asked me. I didn't answer that fully. So could you ask me that last question again? Sorry.
No, of course you can. Yes. Earlier on in the evidence, you were talking about the reinvestment of profits.
The previous
or the previous question to that.
Yeah.
Now you've got me thinking about what I was just asking you. Yes, I think I was asking you really about the extent to which providers could plan ahead.
That's right, yes. So because the fund was usually run on a 3-month basis, it meant that, and it was really up to the wire. In fact, in one instance, the fund wasn't renewed until 2 days after it had already ended. So this consistent extension, 3 months, 3 months, 3 months, meant that providers couldn't plan ahead. So providers usually set their budgets actually about this time of year, because that's the, usually works with the financial year end timing. But if you don't know that you're going to be getting funds 3 months from now that will keep you sustainable, then you can't do that planning in that way.
So your point then is about the lifespan of that fund being uncertain or piecemeal. That also posed an issue. You didn't quite know how long that funding was going to last or when it was going to be made available.
Yeah, and that makes it hard to budget and plan for, what you do in future as well.
Thank you. Overall then, how would Scottish Care assess the approach that was taken to this particular fund? Are there particular suggestions that you would make as to how that might be done differently in the event of a similar event?
Yes, so as I said, fundamentally it was a good thing, and where it worked well, it worked extremely well and did what it was meant to do. So let's learn from those areas where it worked well, and that was where a more light touch regime was applied. I think we could consider something around about setting tolerances, guidance which gives more examples of where funding could be spent, but more opportunities for local authorities to come together with providers on a more national basis as well, so that they can feel through what's an acceptable spend in different parts of the country as well, to speed up that process and to take away that line-by-line nature that was really putting an administrative burden on providers but also on local authorities as well.
So perhaps more coordination between the local authorities.
Yeah.
Thank you. I want to move on then to talk about the second, I think, of the funds that is mentioned in the Scottish Care written response, and that's the Social Care Staff Support Fund. And at paragraph 52 of the written response, I think it mentions the risks that were identified by Scottish Care in March 2020 to those that were experiencing in-work poverty, which potentially compromised their ability to self-isolate. To begin with, please, could you elaborate on what those risks were?
So we were concerned because we know that many people who work in social care are in work poverty. We were concerned that they would feel forced to work, even if they were testing positive with COVID-19, because they needed the money, to eat, to live. And we felt that put them in a difficult position because they may not be eligible to a full rate of sick pay.
And just to elaborate on that, what rates are we talking about, the level of money that they would receive, say, versus being in work or being off sick at that time?
So it would have been it would vary depending on the providers, but it's really down to commissioning models. So we've not seen a significant a significant increase in rates provided to care providers for many years. So we know that the areas where they've had to take the money out of where they spend their funds is often in their ability to deliver fair work terms and conditions. So that means, much less access to paid sick leave. So we know that we wanted to increase that. So they may only have access to the statutory minimum, the requirements.
And that would be statutory sick pay that you're talking about. And do you recall what?
No, I don't know. Okay. But also the minimum number of days as well.
Okay. So in terms of the risk that Scottish Care was concerned about, was that people would perhaps choose still to go to work even if they were ill, for example?
Yeah, so they would be compromised to do so, yes.
I think at paragraph 55 of the written response, I think you also talk about Scottish Care requesting funding for death in service payments to be made to social care staff. Why was that needed?
Well, again, as I'm saying, the increase in commission funding or procured funding to social care providers has led, has the amount they get paid has decreased over the years, and that has led to a decrease in benefits and fair work terms and conditions for staff. And again, death in service is one of those things that we've seen lost.
At paragraph 57 of the written response, it states that Scottish Care then met, I think, with the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport at that time, and that was a meeting between Scottish Care and COSLA. Can I ask what the outcome of that meeting was in respect of these issues that you've mentioned, death in service and sick pay?
So Ms Freeman wrote back to us, and she said that she would introduce the death in service payment for all social care staff, and that she would make an enhancement to statutory sick pay available to staff as well.
And was the creation of this fund, the Social Care Staff Support Fund, was that an outcome of this meeting with the Cabinet Secretary?
Yes, it was.
And do you recall when that fund would have been set up and created?
I don't, but it would be in the letter that was submitted, I think, as an appendix to this.
I think at paragraph 58 it suggests it would have been in June 2020.
Thank you.
If that fits with your own recollection. Okay. Can I ask you then to just explain what the process would be for social care providers to claim from this particular fund? How would that work in practice?
So in the very beginning, they had to go to, and I'm just having a mental blank about the name of the organisation. It's the organisation who administer the Independent Living Fund. It'll come back to me in a second. And they would send in an application to that organisation, who would process that and make the funds available to the provider, who would deliver that payment to the member of staff. Latterly, that moved to be part of the wider sustainability fund claims that then went to local authorities.
And in terms of how that fund operated, was it the same or different to the sustainability fund in the sense that you could prospectively or retrospectively claim? How did that work?
It was slightly different in that you couldn't plan for someone being off sick, so it had to be done retrospectively.
Thank you. And again, in practice, how efficiently or not did that fund work in terms of reimbursing costs for people being off absent?
So again, when, I don't know why I can't remember the name of the organisation that administers the ILF, Inclusion Scotland, there we go. So when it was Inclusion Scotland, it was great, it was administered incredibly effectively. However, it did mean that you were having to do two separate applications. So it did make sense to put them into one application. But as you've already heard, of course, the wider sustainability fund, access to that was so different across Scotland that then that meant it was the same for the social care staff support fund as well.
Thank you. In paragraph 59 of the written response, it talks about there being long delays in payments being reimbursed to social care providers from an early stage. Are you aware as to what the cause of those delays were?
So again, I can only imagine it was down to, well, certainly when we asked, we were told it was down to workforce shortages and their ability to administrate it.
Okay, thank you. And I think, again, what would you say was the financial impact on those social care providers in light of those delays?
Well, what we were starting to see is that because of the huge on-costs that providers were facing, they were really starting to struggle with cash flow, and some of them were telling us they didn't know whether or not they'd be able to make their pay runs in the coming months.
So it would have been a source of anxiety, at least, for
absolutely.
Thank you. I want to move on now to talk about key worker status, if I can. Thank you. In paragraph 62 of the written response, I think you state that social care workers were appropriately identified as key workers by the Scottish Government from the outset of the pandemic. But in paragraph 63, however, I think you highlight a concern which Scottish Care raised with the Scottish Government in March 2020. Could I ask you just to outline for the inquiry what that concern was at that time, please?
Yes. So at that point in time, there was a challenge accessing childcare for key workers, and in the initial times, it was only able to access childcare if more than one adult in the household was a key worker. However, we pointed out that often social care workers were the lower income earner in the household, so they had to reconsider whether or not that was going to be effective, and that really having only one key worker in a household should make them eligible, because what we would find is that the lower income earner would be the one more likely to take the time away from work to stay home with the child. And if that were to be the case, we would see a significant drop in the number of social care workers available.
And was that issue resolved, to your knowledge?
Yes, it was.
Thank you. In paragraph 64 of the written response, I think you also state that issues arose relating to the public perception of social care workers as key workers, even if they were officially recognised as such. Again, could I ask you to elaborate on what the issue was that you're referring to?
Yes, we had a few challenges arise. So, for instance, being able to access supermarkets to get foods. We saw restricted opening times for people who worked in the NHS. They could go at set times. We couldn't access that for social care workers, and in one instance we even had police stopping social care workers and not accepting that they were key workers, because the social care workers who were working together in care at home were travelling in a car together, and this was seen as they were going to be fined by the police for having been travelled in a car together. I think it's worth understanding the context of travelling in a car together. So at that point in time, obviously people were encouraged to travel separately, but for care at home, you're working together in a person's home as well. And they're often travelling together in a car because the alternative is that they're on public transport. So it's safer for them to be in one vehicle because that reduces their exposure to other people, and they're spending time with someone that they would be working on that shift with as well. So the fines were quite arbitrary in that sense. And again, it was just down to public perception and people not knowing what a key worker was, not knowing the role that social care has in society, particularly in that time of pandemic response.
And again, how might Scottish Care suggest that could be improved upon in the event of another pandemic?
Well, I would hope that there's a bit of memory in the public now. Actually, I think we did a lot of work at the time to raise the profile of social care, but it would be extremely helpful if particularly statutory organisations like the police, should there be another pandemic, there was a written notification from government went to organisations to make it obvious or to list social care workers as key workers at those points in time. Though I do hope we don't experience that ever again.
Thank you. I want to just touch on now just longer term impact. At the beginning of your evidence, I think you alluded to a drop in membership numbers perhaps since the pandemic. So I wanted to ask you Scottish Care's view on the longer term effect on the operation of social care since the pandemic.
So the impact of the pandemic lasted significantly longer in social care than in other areas. The way that social care was battered from all sides really socially, in the media, from our politicians, financially, meant that it's taken a very, very long time to recover. And we have lost a lot of extremely good staff, especially managers, during that time, because many of them were frankly just knackered. We've seen a lot of people exit the market, people who were owners of smaller care homes and care at home organisations, particularly in rural, remote areas, just finding it incredibly difficult to manage, either because of workforce shortages or financially since then. So it has been extremely difficult. The workforce crisis has, I'd say, started to settle in urban areas, but it's still a challenge in rural and remote.
Thank you. Wanted to finish then really with lessons learned as something you do touch on in the written statement. In paragraph 65, for example, I think you talk about it being vital that there's recognition of the fact that I think the government is the single purchaser. I think monopsony is the word that you use. Could I ask you to explain about why you think it's important there is that recognition and how that feeds into the financial support for social care providers, please?
Yeah, so most, businesses operate within that competitive marketplace. So there's more than one buyer of the product or the service that they provide. For social care, there really is only one purchaser, and that is local government. And what that does is it gives all the power to local government to really set the rates for what they will provide. Whereas if you work in a competitive marketplace, then there's toing and froing, and a rate will settle depending on what the market requires. But because the buyer has all the influence in that space, what they've done is they've really, really pushed those rates down to a space where there's just no wiggle room left anymore. And of course you saw that in the profit margins that were in the IBIS World report earlier. And as I say, what we're seeing is that care providers up and down the country are closing. In some parts of Scotland, people are having to drive 100 miles now to visit loved ones.
Thank you. In paragraph 66, I think you also call for more flexibility, I think, in respect of care at home services. Could I again ask you to elaborate on what it is that Scottish Care wishes to be taken into account there?
Sorry, I'm just catching up what's in this section. This is a long one. Yes, so in the pandemic, what we saw were quite a lot of change in the type of care at home services that were required. And again, local authorities are the biggest purchaser of care at home services. So many people who access care and support in their own home actually had loved ones come and move in with them during the pandemic, so they no longer needed their care at home service. At those points in time, often we thought, we all thought with hindsight that the pandemic would only be with us for a very short period of time, and that they would sort of manage or muddle through for that period. Also during that time, there was a delay in access to assessments through local authorities, so that meant that fewer people were coming into the system. So what we saw was that actually there were fewer services being required. But then for some people, because they couldn't see their loved ones as often as they had been able to previously before the pandemic, they were maybe needing more care and support. So what we needed was for care providers to have more flexibility in how they delivered that care and support, to be able to step up and step down as an individual required. Whereas some of them had to wait on social work assessments before they could change the type or the amount of care and support that they were giving, which then put further delays and actually potentially put people at risk in their own homes.
Thank you. So to the extent not already covered in your evidence today, are there any other particular matters that you would wish to draw to this inquiry's attention in respect of the financial impact in this business phase?
No, I think I've covered everything. Thank you.
Right. My Lord, I don't have any further questions to ask of the witness.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Stephen, and thank you, Miss Hedge. I'm very grateful for your evidence this afternoon. Thank you. We'll take a short break now before the last session for the day, and we'll come back to hear that at 3 o'clock.
Thank you, my Lord.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, my lord.
Good afternoon, Mr. Turner. Now, we have a panel this afternoon.
We do, my lord. We have a panel from Social Enterprise Scotland consisting of Kim Wallace and Duncan Thorpe.
Now, good afternoon, Miss Wallace and Mr. Thorpe.
Afternoon.
There will be good afternoon. There will be questions for you from Mr. Turner. So, when you're ready, Mr. Turner.
Thank you, my lord. Good afternoon.
Afternoon.
Before we begin, just a small reminder, this afternoon's proceedings will be transcribed. If you could try to speak as clearly and slowly as possible, that will help the transcribers greatly. Could I ask you please each in turn, first of all, to state your full name and your current role, and if different, your role during the pandemic. If I could come to you first, Ms. Wallace.
Sure. My name's Kim Wallace. I'm the Deputy CEO of Social Enterprise Scotland. During the pandemic, I worked for a similar organisation. We worked in partnership. I worked for an organisation called SendScott, and I was the Deputy CEO there. And since the pandemic, we've merged into one organisation.
Thank you. Yes,
and I'm Duncan Thorpe. I'm the Policy and Public Affairs Manager at Social Enterprise Scotland.
Thank you. Social Enterprise Scotland has provided a written response to a Rule 8 request from the inquiry. And for your information, my lord, that is reference SCI SES XXX number 1. And Ms. Wallace, you attended a round table meeting on the 3rd of May 2024 with representatives of members of organisations of Social Enterprise Scotland, and a report of that round table meeting has been produced and approved, and that reference is SCI WT 0852 number 1. In addition to those documents, a number of other documents have been provided by Social Enterprise Scotland. We are going to talk about some of the issues that have been raised in the round table and in the Rule 8 response. We do have a limited amount of time this afternoon, but all the information that has been provided by Social Enterprise Scotland will be taken into account by the inquiry and by His Lordship in his ultimate reporting. First of all, could you tell His Lordship a bit about Social Enterprise Scotland? First of all, how long has it been operating?
We'll be 20 years old in 2025.
Thank you. And who are its members? What sort of organisations?
We have roughly 800 members at the moment, so 700 social enterprise members and 100 supporter members, which are made up of public bodies, private sector organisations, universities.
Thank you. And what is the aim or what is the purpose of Social Enterprise Scotland?
So we're an intermediary organisation, we're member-led, and we represent the broad church of social enterprises across Scotland. And our vision is to build a thriving, wellbeing economy where people and planet come first.
Thank you. I'd like, if we may now, to give His Lordship a bit of an idea about social enterprise sector in Scotland more generally. Could I ask, first of all, how would you define a social enterprise?
So social enterprise is a business that trades for a social environmental purpose and will reinvest most of the profits back into the social and environmental purpose.
Thank you. And are there any particular activities that social enterprises undertake, or is there a broad diversity?
There's a really broad diversity, so anything from working in creative industries to health and social care, wellbeing activities, consumer-facing social enterprises, so a really broad range of activities.
Thank you. And in terms of their activities, when they're providing us a social purpose, who are they actually supporting?
Again, a really broad range of customers and clients, from people in communities that are struggling in terms of kind of food poverty or any kind of poverty, actually. So a whole range of clients and customers.
Thank you. And in terms of you mentioned clients and customers there. other social endeavours in terms of some of their activities, their internal activities, as well as the services they provide?
Yeah, so lots of social enterprises will provide training and employability opportunities for people from really deprived communities.
Thank you. You mentioned supporter organisations, and you gave us a description as to what kind of organisations those are. What is it that supporter organisations actually do for social enterprises?
Again, it varies. So our local authority members will work closely with social enterprises through contracts or service level agreements, work in partnership with social enterprises to deliver services in communities. We work closely with universities. Do you want to say a bit about it?
Yeah, so we work really closely with the universities these days. We've got a universities forum, for example, so we bring together academic partners to really look at ways they're supporting social enterprise, whether it's practical business support or academic research, etc. So we work, I think we work really well with a lot of intermediary organisations these days, local authorities. We've got a local authorities group as well, so we've got lots of forums around these different supporter organisations to really engage them in supporting social enterprise.
And in terms of the private sector, really building markets between the private sector and social enterprises, so encouraging private sector organisations to build social enterprises into their supply chains.
So is that in a sense almost sort of integrating them into the economy almost as well?
Absolutely, yep.
Thank you. If I could now turn to the work of Social Enterprise Scotland during the pandemic. Could you tell His Lordship about the engagement that you had with your member organisations during the pandemic?
Yeah, so I suppose like a lot of organisations, we quickly pivoted, I would say, in terms of our response. Obviously, an initial panic response, which many people had. We eventually pivoted our services and our everything we were doing as a staff team to really serve those members better. I think a lot of our traditional roles in the organisation were kind of dropped in a way, so we had this very much a team effort and looking from scratch about how we support our members in what was really an emergency situation, of course. So we looked at our effectively emergency response. So we created resources on our website, for example, of funding, etc. We spoke to government quite a lot as well, generally on a daily basis to start with, to make sure the right funding support was in place. Emergency funding, of course, and the right business support was adapted, that kind of thing. And also spoke to charitable funders as well to talk about how they might adapt and change what they're doing to help social enterprises. So there's a lot of activities around that. Obviously, we were all online. We kind of had weekly webinars for our members, support webinars, and just connected them in the social way, not just the kind of business support way. So there's lots of different methods we use to really serve our members during that period.
Thank you. And could I ask, how did you assess what kind of support your members needed during the time?
Well, we actually went through quite a thorough process, really. So as a staff team, again, at this time there's about 4 or 5 staff members, I think, and we literally picked up the phone to all our members individually and, recorded all the information about what they were telling us and what was happening with them on the ground, which was a really valuable exercise. I think at the time we had around 300 members. So between 4 or 5 of us, it took quite a long time to get through that list, but that was one of our top priorities, is really serving our members better and just making sure they were okay, asking what they needed, and then recording that, and obviously then giving that information to government as well to make sure the right support was in place. So it's quite a thorough process, I think.
And did that information feed into any kind of reporting? You said you fed back to government. How was that done?
Yeah, so we did, I think it was 3 reports called State of the Sector, which we'd provided as part of the evidence, I think in total during the entire lockdown period, which really, fed back all those thoughts, really. Not just those reports as well, but other information to government as well as in conversations as well, weekly conversations, daily conversations to start with. So we fed back to government in various ways and just tried to really get a kind of evidence base, really. Again, it was quite a chaotic period where the evidence base was a bit messy, I think, at times, but I think we got that information to government quite quickly, actually, as well.
And what sort of feedback were you giving to government at that time in terms of that information?
It was really, as I said, emergency response. It was like, organisations not having money, not having income, like everybody, like it was for everybody really. So in terms of grant funding, what grant funding can be put in place to help people, how many social enterprises are accessing the UK government's furlough scheme, all these different, all the different aspects, charitable funding, as I mentioned before, what they're doing to support social enterprises during the time, etc. And I feel like the response was really good. I mean, obviously we might go into more detail about that, but the government response I think was quite positive at that time.
Do I take from that you feel that they took on board the information that you were giving to them?
I think so, yeah. I think we felt very listened to at that time, certainly. And I think the financial support, that emergency financial support was put in place, I think, quite quickly as well. So we were quite pleasantly surprised in a way, because, government machines can work quite slowly. So we were quite pleased, I think, with that response, yeah.
Thank you. You mentioned there that you were putting in place information resources for your members, webinars, I think you mentioned, and other things. What sort of information were you providing to your members at that time?
So yeah, we had an online page on our website which had a variety of resources, financial as well as business support, etc., and just anything we could possibly find to help our members. In terms of webinars, they were, I think, very, very frequent on a variety of topics, dominated by funding, I think, to start with, really. I think that was the main focus, and then it moved on to other things as well, like what business support is available. It's generally these two things, funding and business support, which is the things they needed, in that very, very strange time, I think.
Sorry, I was just going to add, we had probably quite early on, I think it was, I've got here the week commencing the 12th of May, we hosted a week-long series of webinars online, so something we'd picked up from members in the very kind of early stages where folk feeling kind of isolated, everybody moving online, etc. So bringing people together just to share what they were doing in different communities across Scotland, so people were sharing information and sharing ideas, but we hosted a whole range of webinars over the week. We had something like 800 individuals participating across 300 different organisations. So we kind of mentioned earlier that social enterprises work in a variety of different areas. So we were providing information for sports organisations, for community food organisations, for health and social care organisations. We're bringing in public bodies that work in those areas, like Creative Scotland, for example, were one of the organisations that we work. So we're bringing specific information to different thematic groups of social enterprises.
Did you find that your members were approaching Social Enterprise Scotland for information around that time?
Yeah.
They were looking for assistance?
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
And are you able to tell His Lordship why that was?
I think has been, I mean, certainly from a SENSCOT perspective, just being a member-led organisation and being a kind of go-to place for, historically being a go-to place for information and support for the sector. We were kind of probably the obvious place to go at that time, and a lot of connection. We supported a lot of networks as well, so there was always a lot of peer support and collaboration happened across the work that we do. So I think just a kind of obvious place to go at that time for organisations looking for support. And I think there was a lot of information coming out of a whole variety of different organisations as well. People were getting quite confused by lots of information, so as Duncan said, having that kind of one-stop shop, having everything posted on the one place on a website was really beneficial, I think.
You mentioned organisations there, not just members. Were other people contacting Social Enterprise Scotland around that time?
Sorry, mostly just social
members.
enterprises, yeah.
Okay. You mentioned there the information coming from other sources. One of the big sources of information, of course, is the Scottish Government, in terms of a lot of guidance that was issued around that time. Are you able to tell His Lordship how your members found that guidance? Was it high quality? Was it understandable?
I mean, I think a lot of guidance is good quality, yeah, but I think one of our jobs was really just translating anything that came in from government or other sources to make sure it was of relevance to our members, and it's often a translation job, I think, in our work, to get the information to our members in a simplified way. So I think, yeah, I feel like it was good quality information, but I think there was a lot of information, that was the thing, and from various different sources, UK government, Scottish government, many other sources in addition as well, which obviously does complicate things for people, gets people confused. There's obviously inevitable duplication as well. So again, it's our job really as membership organisations, intermediary organisations, to really sort through all that and make sure it makes sense to members really.
You mentioned there the complexity and the fact that you were simplifying some of that information. Was there anything in particular that you were doing to simplify that for your members?
Yeah, I suppose in various ways. I mean, the resource page on our website, that kind of, we simplified things, posted web links to various resources on that page, but also within webinars and conversations, people would ask us questions and we'd be like, well, we know where we can find this information for you, we'll send it on to you, that kind of thing. And we were kind of the signposting organisation, which is what we do anyway in normal circumstances. But I think that signposting role is really essential, yeah.
Thank you. We've touched upon quite a number of things that Social Enterprise Scotland were doing during the pandemic. Was there anything else that you were doing particularly? Now, there may not be, we may have covered everything there, but was there anything else that you were doing particularly that you'd like to highlight to His Lordship?
I suppose it's really just the focus of the organisation. Everything was targeted towards this emergency response. That's what it was about. So all the normal roles kind of disappeared in a way, all the normal tasks, all the normal events, these kind of things. For example, on our annual awards, we thought it was a bit inappropriate to have an annual awards. So we pivoted to having I can't remember the name of it now, but it was like a kind of showcase, basically, rather than awards, just making sure things are adapted to be a bit more appropriate to those circumstances.
Thank you. And in terms of the organisation, how many people actually work within Social Enterprise Scotland itself, the organisation?
At that time, it was about 4 or 5, I think it was at the time, and now it's 11 or 12.
It's 11 of us now. I think between the two organisations, it would have been about 14 or 15 members of staff.
And how did your staff find? I appreciate that. I'm saying you're and your former, of course, staff. How did they find the position at the time during the pandemic?
I think it was really challenging for all of us. Like everybody in the country, going from working in an office Monday to Friday, pretty much 9 to 5, to getting everybody set up, making sure they were able to be online at home and be comfortable whilst they're doing that, and not sitting at a dining room table. So there was a lot of that in terms of making sure our own staff were okay and welfare. And I think it was particularly challenging for maybe staff that live alone. So I had a couple of members of staff who stay alone and found that whole kind of lockdown period particularly difficult. So I think, first and foremost, there was the kind of making sure staff was okay, and then focusing on what we could do to support our members. But, I remember quite clearly that first week or 2 weeks, thinking, how are we going to support our members? What can we do? Just taking a bit of time for staff to kind of bed in and get used to working from home.
Yeah, I think it's the same in both organisations, really, pretty much the same. It's just that kind of initial shock period, that initial kind of alarm, and then kind of settling down a bit into a routine of working from home, as you said, and just really then looking at staff well-being as well. So it took us a while, I think, to do that, but we did that eventually and got some kind of staff well-being and support in place, which was really valuable. So,
thank you. If I could now perhaps turn to questions relating to your members themselves and the impacts on the social enterprises during the pandemic. Were there any changes that happened to member services during that time?
Yeah, so I think most social enterprises, to use the popular word of pivoting, would have pivoted at that time. Lots of social enterprises moved their services online. So lots of social enterprises that provide wellbeing services moved them online quite quickly so that people could access that support, particularly around the kind of loneliness and social isolation, to connect individuals that would have normally have come into potentially physical centres, community centres or sports centres and health and wellbeing premises. So lots of stuff moved online at that time. And then an additional lot of social enterprises moved to providing food packages and delivering prescriptions and a whole range of things that they wouldn't have done pre-COVID.
So just to be clear, when you're saying pivoting, we're talking about pivoting in terms of how services are delivered, but also what
they deliver.
services are being delivered.
Yeah.
And I mean, you've mentioned a few there. Were these services that social enterprises had provided previously, or were people entering into whole new areas?
Both. So some social enterprises moved into delivering completely new services during COVID, and other social enterprises would potentially have been delivering, for example, food packages or food banks and things previously. So they just kind of continued to do that or ramped that work up during COVID.
In terms of these new services, I presume very often they're the kinds of services that other people are providing as well within the community, whether within Social Enterprise Scotland or not. Did you find your members coordinating their response? And if so, how did they do that?
Yeah, I think we had really good examples of people coming, or social enterprises at a local level coming together and supporting one another, but coordinating their responses as well. I think there are lots of social enterprise networks across Scotland already, so we do generally collaborate quite well anyway, but I think during COVID it certainly kind of ramped up, and we saw a lot more coordination and collaboration between our members at a local level, particularly around food provision.
And in terms of that coordination collaboration, you obviously talked about the pivoting of the third sector and their collaboration between each other. Did you find, or did your members find, that the public sector were getting involved in that collaboration?
I think mixed views on that. So in some instances, yes, but I think in some instances, I mean, certainly within the roundtable discussion that we had, some of the members then felt that the kind of public sector at a local level retreated and weren't as active or easy to work with at that time.
Is that a, I mean, forgive me, is that a change from normal? I mean, in ordinary times, out with the pandemic, would public sectors be involved with social enterprises ordinarily? Yeah. So in a sense, they've gone from being involved to, as I think the word you used was, retreated from that position.
Yeah.
Okay. You've talked about the pivoting and the changes that were made in terms of how services were being delivered. You've spoken about the fact that new services were being delivered and expanding. That expansion, did that have any effect on the members or I suppose on their staff in terms of what they were doing?
Yeah, so social enterprises will have obviously paid staff, but rely heavily on volunteers as well. So we would have seen an increase in demand for services during COVID. So obviously that would have had an impact on staff and volunteers. So within quite a short period of time, you were having volunteers and staff kind of burning out because they were just working all the time. It wasn't a kind of Monday to Friday thing anymore. It was 7 days a week, and being able to open to their communities all the time.
In terms, you used the phrase burnout there. Did they find they were losing staff and volunteers because of that?
I think in the early days of COVID, we saw an increase in the number of volunteers initially. Obviously, when other sectors were furloughing staff, people were at home and kind of wanting to do something and get involved. So there was quite an increase in volunteering at the early stages, but that would have kind of petered off after a time. And as I say, with that increase in demand, I think social enterprises, by their very nature, obviously find it difficult to kind of say no, so they would have just have kept on taking on more and doing more at that time.
And has that had any effect in terms of the availability of staff and volunteers going forward?
I think now there's we're seeing kind of reduced number of volunteers, so it's a bit of an issue just now. So there's a real spike during the pandemic, but that's dropped significantly since COVID.
Thank you. If I could now just turn to the topic of money. You mentioned before providing advice regarding funding opportunities for your members and the like. I suppose the first question is, were your members under financial pressure at that time?
Very much so, I think. Absolutely. I think, yeah, for a lot of them, it was a kind of, there was an immediate, ceasing of trading. Obviously some of them could access the furlough scheme or could access the Third Sector Resilience Fund and its kind of successor funds. But yeah, I think pretty much all of them, suffered in some sense that initial phase, at least before, government support came into place, which came into place quite quickly. But I think at those initial stages, yeah, certainly.
It may be implicit from the name, but in terms of how social enterprises are funded ordinarily, one assumes from the name these are enterprises. These are generally involved, as you say, in the supply chains, etc. Where does the money come from ordinarily out with the pandemic for these kinds of organisations?
Well, it's a mixture really. So it's, as you said, the clues in the name enterprise. So they are trading organisations, trading businesses, but some of them do access funding. Some don't actually, but some access funding as well. So it's a mixture depending on the social enterprise, depending on their sector, their business model, that kind of thing.
Does that mean that in terms of, and I don't wish to rehear last week's evidence, but in terms of the impacts that we heard on businesses more generally, are all those things also applicable in respect of social enterprises generally?
I think so, yeah. I mean, like most social enterprises are small businesses and micro businesses, so it's probably more in common with the small business community, yeah. Certainly the same challenges, I would think, yeah.
Thank you. And in terms of the pandemic itself, was there additional funding available to social enterprises?
Yeah. So there was two kind of main funds that were made available. So the first one was a resilience fund, and the second one was called Adapt and Thrive, which was more about organisations accessing that funding to help them to pivot and look at new opportunities and new services. And they were both available pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And again, as Duncan has said earlier, that kind of engagement with Scottish Government at that time would have been on a daily basis. So we were able to kind of shape and inform those funds.
And they were both Scottish Government grant schemes as well. There were a number of other things as well, I think, available for third sector organisations at that time, plus small businesses, plus, as I mentioned, the UK Government furlough scheme, and obviously charitable funders themselves. There's lots of different sources, but the main ones, I think, those two were in there, I think, the main government ones.
And did you have any feedback from your members in terms of how easy it was to access those funds?
It seemed relatively easy, I think, didn't it? I think that was the main feedback, actually. I think everything was flexible at this time. I think everything was more flexible than usual in terms of funding. It was very, rules were kind of put aside, I think, in the next kind of crisis situation. So I think it was fairly easy, and again, as we mentioned before, quite quick for those funds to come about, I think, as well.
Yeah, kind of less bureaucratic than normal.
Right. And you've obviously mentioned that you had signposted in terms of your own website, etc., funding opportunities, but out with that, did you feel that these opportunities for funding were being readily made or readily advertised, I suppose, to your members, or were you the source of information for your members?
We were a source of our information, so our members are often can be members of other organisations as well. So there was a flow of information coming out at that time in relation to whatever funding was available.
And did you feel that information was enough for people to find out about these funds?
We think so, yeah. I mean, in terms of our various networks, our various connections, through our own networks, but also SCVO organisations like that as well, third sector organisations. I think there was quite a groundswell of organisations doing that, which we do all year round anyway. It's kind of our job to highlight opportunities to our members, etc. So I think government do rely on that, I guess, those kind of networks, those kind of grassroots networks to really publicise these types of funding streams.
Thank you. You talked about the removal of bureaucracy and things working a bit, my words not yours, but easier in terms of the application processes. Did any of your members have any difficulties with eligibility for funding support? Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so one of the restrictions in the funds were if social enterprises had reserves of more than 6 months, they weren't eligible for the funds. So kind of seeing the impact of that now with some organisations who had to use their reserves during COVID and then straight into a cost of living crisis with no reserves left in the tank, basically. So those social enterprises in particular feel that they were penalised a bit for being well run and well managed going into the pandemic and having that 6-month reserve position. So they certainly, I think, felt penalised.
And there was also, I suppose, in addition to that, was early stage startups as well. Sometimes it was too early in their kind of processes, their financial reporting, I guess, to really be eligible for some of these funds. Also sole traders as well. I think initially there was no furlough scheme for sole traders. I think that was remedied relatively quickly when they realised that gap was there. But there was kind of, early stage startups was an issue as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I think you mentioned this before, but just to be clear, in terms of the timing of that support that was coming forward for social enterprises, you mentioned obviously there were some gaps that were then filled. Did your members feel that the support was forthcoming timeously?
I think so.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. I think another kind of group, I mean, we just mentioned their social enterprises will have a mixture. Most will have a mixture of enterprise income generation, trading activity, and receive grants. And I think organisations that had a higher trading income were disproportionately affected because a lot of social enterprises that had grant funding going into the pandemic were allowed to use that grant funding maybe to support core costs. So if you had a higher trading income and less grants, then again you were kind of disproportionately affected.
Thank you. And in terms of that, I think you mentioned before, where there was grant funding and it had been ring-fenced, were there changes in respect of that in terms of ability to use that money?
I think so, yeah, particularly from charitable funders as well, the kind of big, big lottery, Robertson Trust, these types of organisations that fund charitable organisations, they seemed to be flexible. They seemed to have dropped a lot of their bureaucracy, a lot of their red tape for organisations so they could access that funding and, as you said, use it for core costs rather than just special projects, etc. And I think that seemed to be the case across all the different funding areas.
Thank you. You mentioned a couple of times there changes to the bureaucracy, both in terms of application, but also in terms of the utilisation of funding. What kind of bureaucracy was being changed at that time?
I mean, it's generally around the funding. I mean, that was the main thing we're talking about here, I guess, is the funding, and it's just saying to people, yeah. You might have a special fund for a particular project or a particular group you're working with, but that funding was then allowed to be used for other purposes, as you said, core costs, paying staff, basically, to make sure people have jobs, etc. So it was kind of really, that was probably one of the main areas, I would think.
I think the application processes and the forms would have been simplified at that time, and the decision-making process was a lot shorter than it would be normally.
We've talked there about funds being used for different things. Out with the pandemic, would you ordinarily be required to report on what you're spending money?
Yeah.
And did that change at all during the pandemic?
I'm not sure about reporting, actually. I'm not sure about that particular one.
Yeah, probably less rigorous than it would be out with the pandemic.
Thank you. We've talked about the reduction in reserves in consequence of people having to draw down money. Taking account of that and other things, or anything else, how have social enterprises fared in consequence of the pandemic?
Yeah, I was trying to think where to start with that. Yeah, I suppose in terms of, we have something called the Social Enterprise Census, which measures the scale and scope of social enterprise every 2 years, roughly speaking. So the last stats we have are 2021. So we are now awaiting the latest statistics, which will obviously be post-pandemic. They've been delayed because of the pandemic, etc. So we are kind of awaiting those stats. I mean, there are, according to the last census, there are over 6,000 social enterprises in Scotland, for example, providing around 90,000 jobs, 2.63 billion gross value added economic contribution. So we've got quite solid stats around this, but we're waiting on the latest statistics effectively.
So we had hoped it would have been available for today,
Yes.
but it'll be January before they're published.
We can touch base with you in January, and we'll be interested to hear those stats. I mean, in terms of the position pre and post pandemic, has there been much of a change in terms of the landscape of social enterprises, in terms of the numbers, or in terms of the types of things they're doing?
I mean, so we are waiting on the census to really give us that really big full picture, but I think anecdotally, I think a lot of the crisis we predicted at the very beginning didn't turn out to be the case, because the funding came into place quite quickly, because obviously our services were there as well, business support was adapted, so all these changes did happen, which I think saved quite a lot of organisations as well as a lot of them obviously struggling a huge amount. So I think we're hopeful that when the census is published, that those stats will be favourable in terms of those various interventions we had. But we just have to wait and see for those stats. And there is a service called the Crisis Button, which is about organisations that are currently in crisis. I think you maybe have the stats around that.
Yeah, so there have been a lot of social enterprises that are struggling, or there are a lot of social enterprises that are really struggling just now. And I think coming out the back of COVID straight into a cost of living crisis, which, you know, in terms of energy and stuff, we're still in. So particularly social enterprises running any kind of facilities, really challenged. So since December last year, there's been about 133 social enterprises that have came forward for crisis support. And the requests have been coming from across all sectors that social enterprises work in, across 30 of the 32 local authorities, and 3/4 of organisations that have had that crisis support are still going, with 1/4 of them preparing or having closed already. So I think we're just kind of feeling the impacts of all of that now, as I say, coming out of COVID into cost of living crisis is kind of taking its toll on a lot of social enterprises.
Thank you. That's given us a very clear indication of where we are. In terms of the members, could I now please just turn, I suppose, back to members' operations? You've obviously talked to us this afternoon about things that were changed, both in terms of what social enterprises do, but also how they interact with each other and indeed with the public sector. Have any of those changes been sustained? So, for example, the way that they interact with the public sector, has that been sustained post-pandemic?
I think often no, I would say. That's probably the quite blunt answer there. So I think we've seen public authorities, for example, not just public authorities, but other organisations kind of go back to the way things were before the pandemic, which is not necessarily a good thing. So that flexibility, the kind of bureaucracy, etc., that has gone back to the way it was before. I would say, broadly speaking, I'm sure there'll be exceptions where in some local areas, you know, organisations, local authorities will be working better in some ways, but I think that's the general picture we get when we speak to social enterprises, that things have gone back to pre-pandemic levels, which we understand in some ways. Of course, you need bureaucracy, it's important, you need rules in place for accountability, but it's public money, but I think we didn't really learn that lesson, I would say, from the pandemic.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think we came out the back of the pandemic with quite an optimism around things being done in a different way. There was a lot of talk about building back better, but that seems to have kind of slipped away. And we've, kind of Duncan says, kind of reverted back to old ways of working. So it's a shame that we haven't kind of kept that going.
And in terms of funding, how is the position now in terms of funding going forward?
Really challenging. So, you know, a lot of really challenging in terms of funding at the moment. Was kind of saying there that kind of out the back of the cost of living crisis and the NI contributions and stuff going up as well in the coming months. It's a really challenging operating environment at the moment.
Thank you. You've obviously talked about quite a lot of positive things this afternoon as well, in terms of partnership working and some of the ways that social enterprises have expanded their provision to the benefit of society. Have any of those kinds of things been sustained post-pandemic?
I think partnership working, I would say certainly from our perspective, we're working more in partnership with organisations than we ever have done before, which I think is really good. I think that's certainly a pandemic lesson. Use of new technologies, for example, as well. Obviously, we all switched to Zoom quite quickly, and we've kind of sustained that, I think, as well, in terms of some of our events, our engagement with members and other social enterprises, that kind of thing. So I think there's some really real optimism in there, I think, as well. But the partnership working, I think, yeah, that has continued in some ways. And I guess in some local authority areas, you will find organisations saying, actually, we are working better in partnership with similar organisations, for example, to maybe reduce duplication, that kind of thing.
Yep.
Thank you. Just two more questions, I think, from me. His Lordship, one of the main things His Lordship will be looking at in reporting in this inquiry is lessons to be learned from the pandemic. Are there any particular lessons that you think His Lordship should consider in relation to social enterprises?
It's quite a long list, I feel.
as long as you like, Mr. Thorpe.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose let's learn from what happened with the social enterprise and third sector funding, to be honest. That reached organisations quite quickly, reduction in bureaucracy. Let's learn those things, and let's the private sector and other sectors learn from that as well. So there are lots of positives here, I think. Eligibility of the funding, as we mentioned already, I think that's a really big issue going forward. We need to make sure that organisations have money up front. They're eligible, or everybody's covered effectively. Nobody misses out. I mean, there was one example of somebody I spoke to, who was a very early stage startup, who mentioned before, who had to access universal credit. It's the only funding available to that person. So I think eligibility criteria funding is a good lesson to learn as well. I think what else to add to that is a lot.
Yeah, I think just in terms of coordination of funding between the different funders, so I think that got better as time went on, so it's completely understandable. But I think, if we were going into this again, getting that right from the get-go would be really important. So we know when the funds some of the funding was first made available, that different social enterprises were being approached by different funders around the same funding to do the same things. So that coordination, I think, between funders could be better from the get-go. Understandable, but there's definitely lessons to be learned there.
So that's effectively, I hate to use the word too many, but that's multiple people coming in offering support from various things, with a lack of coordination from the funders. Looking at that in reverse, if you like, did that mean that when somebody was looking for funding, they were having to go to multiple sources as well in that kind of way? And is there anything that could have been done to improve that?
I think, to be honest, at that time, social enterprises would have just been kind of going wherever they were seeing that there was funding available. So, I suppose just that coordination coming from top down would be really important.
And of course, we understand, obviously, the situation was a chaotic situation, it was a crisis situation, so a lot of this stuff was quite inevitable, I would say. I mean, another thing would be cross-sector working as well. I think we need to really learn the lesson of that. When public sector, private sector, third sector work together, they can have far more powerful outcomes for communities in terms of policy, etc. And that's something we really need to learn going forward.
Thank you. That was all the specific points I wanted to raise with you this afternoon. In a moment, I'm going to give you one final chance if you think there's anything else that you haven't covered this afternoon which you'd like to mention to His Lordship, then I'll give you that opportunity to do so. Before I do that, I'll just remind you, we have your Relate response. We have the report from the round table, which obviously takes into account both your input and indeed some input from some of your members, and a number of documents that you've provided, including your reports that you referred to earlier on, Mr. Thorpe. But if there is anything that you would like to say to His Lordship, I'll give you that opportunity now.
I don't think I've got anything to add, thanks.
I suppose the general point, really, I suppose a lot of our members, what they really found during the pandemic lockdown period was a lot of the people they help in normal circumstances, people living in poverty, with inequality, etc., these problems really came out during the pandemic. They were really exposed. I think some of them were kind of beneath the service a bit, I think, but during the pandemic, these became critical, these issues kind of thing, and we really exposed some of the facets of our economy effectively, of, you know, how broken our economy is. And I think, yeah, there's a real lesson to learn there, I think, about, you know, what happened during the pandemic. Let's really analyse that. Let's look at how people suffered, how the poorest in our society really suffered, how those inequalities are really exposed for the first time, I think, really starkly. And let's just look at some new solutions, new policy solutions we can come up with as a result of this.
Thank you. My Lord, I don't have any other I don't have any further questions unless your Lordship has anything to add.
No, thank you, Mr. Turner. All that remains for me to do is to thank Ms. Wallace and Mr. Thorpe for their evidence this afternoon. And that brings an end to today's session, and we will resume again at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Thank you very much indeed.
Obliged, my Lord.
Thank you.